Mornings when you wake up and feel like something invisible has slipped through your life during the night, something essential yet unnamed. You move through the day like a shadow of yourself, answering messages, sipping coffee, smiling at the right times, but all the while sensing a quiet disconnection beneath the surface. You're not broken. You're not failing. What you're feeling is the soft call of the second half of life. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity does not arrive with age or obligation. It arrives with awakening, with the strange, sacred moment when what used to satisfy you suddenly no longer does. When roles feel tight, when success feels hollow, and when the mirror reflects a face that looks familiar but no longer feels like home. Jung did not see this as a crisis. He saw it as a crossing, a threshold between who you were trained to be and who you truly are. His vision of human development was not limited to childhood or trauma recovery. He saw adulthood as its own vast and unexplored terrain where true transformation could finally begin. Unlike Freud, who looked backward toward origin wounds, Jung looked inward and forward, toward myths, symbols, and the living unconscious. He mapped the psyche not as a fixed structure, but as a spiraling journey through inner landscapes where the ego is only the beginning. According to him, life unfolds in stages, not just by age, but by depth. The athlete, the warrior, the statesman, the spirit. These aren't roles to perform, but inner seasons of becoming. The athlete is obsessed with image and strength. The warrior seeks power, control, and victory. The statesman learns responsibility and legacy. And finally, the spirit searches for meaning beyond masks, beyond ego, beyond time. But here's what Jung warned. You cannot skip stages. Each one holds a necessary fire. Each one tests you, reveals you, burns away illusion. The athlete must tire. The warrior must fall. The statesman must relinquish control. Only then can the spirit emerge, not as an escape, but as the integration of all that came before. Psychological maturity is not perfection, it is wholeness. It is the quiet strength of someone who has met every version of themselves and chosen to carry all of them forward. This article is your guide through that inner terrain, through the stories, patterns, and symbolic thresholds that Jung believed we all must face to truly grow. And as you walk through the following stages, know this. The journey is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering someone ancient within you who has waited patiently through every season of forgetting. The first stage of growth, which Jung called the athlete, is not merely a phase of physical development. It is a mirror into the birth of the ego. It is the time in life when we look outward to define who we are. When we measure our worth by appearance, achievement, and approval, it is when the body becomes a stage, the gaze of others our spotlight, and we begin to form the fragile scaffolding of identity through what can be seen, touched, and validated. In this stage, the world is still external. We are still becoming, but in that becoming, there is a tremble of insecurity we rarely admit. Beneath the polished selfies, the pursuit of popularity, and the obsession with aesthetics, lies a question we are too afraid to ask. Am I enough without this mask? The ego, in its earliest form, does not emerge from arrogance. It rises from fear, from the child who learns that being seen is safer than being ignored, that being beautiful earns attention, and that being strong protects from rejection. And so we sculpt ourselves not from soul, but from survival. Imagine a teenage boy standing silently in front of a mirror, lifting his shirt to examine his body. His chest is too narrow, and his arms are too thin. He grimaces, pulls at his skin, and tenses his muscles. He scrolls through images of influencers online, comparing and shrinking inside. Later, he posts a photo with a forced smile and filters applied, then waits. Refreshes, waits again. The likes come slowly. He tells himself it doesn't matter. But part of him aches. Not because he is vain, but because he is uncertain of who he is without approval. This boy does not yet know that the reflection he seeks is not on the screen, but within. He is living the athlete stage, where the body speaks the language of the soul, and the ego is loud because the self is still whispering from the shadows. Jung believed that the ego, while often demonized, is necessary. It is the first container of identity, the seed from which maturity can one day grow. But if we remain trapped within it, clinging to surface validation, the ego hardens into a shell that separates us from our deeper self. At its best, the athlete stage teaches us how to inhabit our body, move with strength, and develop the kind of confidence that is rooted in presence rather than performance. Sports, dance, and movement are not just physical outlets, they are rituals of embodiment. When we move our bodies with intention, we begin to listen. We feel. We become acquainted with ourselves beneath the noise. The stillness after a long run, the breathlessness after a swim, the moment you forget the mirror and remember the joy. These are the sacred cracks where the ego gives way to something more real. Yet, this stage is dangerous when prolonged, when we become addicted to image, intoxicated by the mirror, and start believing we are only as good as our appearance or achievements. We begin to lose touch with others, and even with our own souls. A person who never outgrows the athlete stage becomes emotionally shallow, overly competitive, and incapable of deep empathy. They may mock vulnerability, chase admiration, and secretly collapse when alone. They have built a temple around the ego, but left the inner sanctuary empty. To mature beyond the athlete, we must reclaim the body as a vessel, not a billboard. We must accept our imperfections as invitations to know ourselves, not flaws to correct for acceptance. Self-consciousness is not sculpted from symmetry, but from self-compassion. And if adolescence teaches us anything, it's that the pain of not belonging outwardly is often a call to belong inwardly. That our longing to be admired is really a longing to be understood. Jung taught that identity formed only in the image of others is fragile. True maturity begins when we stop asking how we look and start asking who we are. This does not mean rejecting the body, but honoring it as part of the whole, a messenger of energy, emotion, and instinct. In adolescence, we are given the ego not to worship, but to shape, not to become imprisoned by it, but to eventually outgrow it. The athlete stage, then, is not a mistake to regret, but a mirror to look through, a necessary chapter in our lifelong journey toward wholeness. And if we listen closely, we will hear the body telling us when it's time to move on, when strength without purpose becomes empty, when beauty without soul begins to fade, when applause no longer satisfies. That is when the next stage begins to whisper, not louder, but deeper. It is the voice of the warrior, rising not to impress the world, but to face the inner one. If the athlete stage taught us how to stand in our own skin, then the warrior stage teaches us how to stand in the world. It is here that the ego, once shaped by mirrors, is now tested by fire. The warrior stage is the call to forge identity, not in isolation, but in motion, by striving, falling, rebuilding, and rising again. This is the season of becoming, not as an idea, but as a lived challenge. You wake up not asking who you are, but what you're willing to do. And in that question begins the birth of responsibility. It is no longer enough to be seen. Now, you must be reliable. You must take the dream you held close in youth and carry it into the wind of adulthood, where resistance and reality meet you head-on. And many, despite good intentions, are not ready for that weight, not because they are weak, but because a part of them still hopes someone else will carry it for them. Jung believed that within every adult is a lingering child, a voice that longs for safety, praise, and protection without the burden of consequence. And if we do not acknowledge that child, we risk letting it steer the course of our adult lives from the shadows. You can spot it in those who speak of dreams but recoil at effort, in those who inherit comfort yet never grow courage, in those who demand love but cannot offer it in return. These are not evil traits. They are echoes of a self still clinging to the fantasy that life owes us something for simply wanting it. But life does not bend to will alone. It responds to what we build, what we break through, and what we dare to face when no one else is watching. Picture a young man standing backstage, gripping a worn resume, heart racing in his chest. He studied art. He once believed he would be famous by now. But he's just walked 20 blocks in worn shoes to reach an interview for a job he never imagined taking. The stage he dreamed of feels far away. The applause that used to echo in his fantasies is silent. For a moment he feels ashamed. Then something shifts. He remembers that this job, though not glamorous, is a step, a choice, a means to stay afloat while he continues to practice, to write, to push forward without entitlement. In that moment, he becomes a warrior, not because he won anything, but because he refused to give up when the path grew steep. This is the heart of the warrior stage. Perseverance without praise, action without applause, effort without guarantees. It is when you begin to understand that the world is not here to hand you your worth. It is here to reflect back what you are willing to work for. It is also a time when relationships deepen. You begin to seek more than attraction. You look for substance, compatibility, and shared values. But these too demand work. The warrior cannot expect a partner to complete them, only to walk beside them. And this requires humility. It asks you to stop placing all responsibility on the other and instead ask, how can I become the kind of person I would want to love? Often in this stage, we confront a quiet grief, the grief of old illusions falling away, the belief that love is effortless, that success is fast, and that identity is fixed. These fall like leaves in late summer, making space for something truer. Jung spoke of this stage as the moment the ego collides with life, where idealism gives way to integrity, where the fantasies of childhood are tempered by the fires of adult reality. This is not the death of dreams, but the birth of discipline. And there are moments, many of them, when the warrior wants to give in, when rejection feels personal, when trying feels futile, when comparison poisons joy. These are not signs of failure. They are the friction that shapes the soul. They are the moments when you learn that discipline is love in action, that showing up for your dreams, your partner, your values day after day is the ultimate act of devotion. But this stage is not only about ambition, it is also about discernment. The warrior must learn which battles are worth fighting and which are distractions of the ego. There is power in focus. And just as important, there is power in saying no to shortcuts, to temptations, to false identities that promise ease but steal purpose. In this way, maturity begins to form, not only through movement, but through restraint. And when the warrior perseveres long enough, with heart and humility, something profound happens. Success may come, yes, but more importantly, clarity arrives. You begin to see that the true reward of this stage was never the title, or the wealth, or the validation. It was the self you became in the process. The one who can stand in both defeat and dignity, who has known effort without recognition and still continued. That self is no longer defined by youth's performance or early dreams, but by depth, resilience, and grounded integrity. And so the warrior, having walked through fire, begins to look not only outward, but inward. The sun has reached its noon. Strength has matured into steadiness. The hunger to prove has softened into the wisdom to protect. And just beyond the horizon, the next stage quietly waits, not to build, but to serve, not to conquer, but to contribute. It is the stage where the warrior becomes a steward, the next step in the journey of psychological maturity, the one Jung called the statement. There comes a moment in life, not marked by age, but by a subtle turning, when the fire that once drove us outward begins to burn inward. After years of striving, competing, building, and becoming, the soul whispers a quieter question. Not, what can I achieve, but what can I give? This is the threshold of the statement stage. And unlike the noise and urgency of earlier phases, its arrival is soft. sometimes mistaken for restlessness, discontent, or even emptiness. But it is not an absence. It is a reorientation. The inner compass, once fixated on the self, now begins to point toward the whole, toward love, toward legacy, toward something more enduring than applause or titles. As Jung described, this is the noon of the psyche, the sun at its zenith. It casts no long shadows, but shines directly into the heart. And what it reveals is both beautiful and humbling, that our value is no longer proven through conquest, but expressed through connection. In this stage, the ego, which once fought so hard to exist, slowly loosens its grip, and in its place, something older and more essential emerges: empathy. Not the surface-level sympathy that offers comfort from a distance, but the kind of knowing that comes from having walked the road yourself. You begin to see others not as competitors or instruments, but as fellow travelers, each carrying their own invisible weight. Where the warrior was concerned with impact, the statement stage is concerned with intimacy, with the invisible marks we leave on others' souls, not just the visible ones on our resumes. But reaching this point is not without its cost. For many, this shift is heralded by what we call a midlife reckoning. The sudden awareness that the ladder we've been climbing may be leaning against the wrong wall. It often begins with a disquiet that's hard to name. A man who has spent his entire life pursuing promotions wakes up one morning, sits at the edge of his bed, and wonders why he feels so hollow. His home is large, his reputation is solid, but the laughter in his house has grown thin. The conversations with his children feel scripted. His marriage functions but no longer breathes. For the first time, he asks himself, if I disappeared tomorrow, would it matter? Not just to the company, but to the hearts he's supposed to be tethered to. This is not a crisis of failure, it is a crisis of depth. And it signals that the soul is asking for something more enduring than performance. It is asking for meaning. The statement stage is where we confront a deeper truth, that immortality, as Jung hinted, does not lie in how long we are remembered, but in the quality of what we gave while we were here. It's the difference between success and significance, between influence and intimacy. And while not all of us will cure diseases or write books that change the world, each of us carries the capacity to shape the lives of those we touch. Through presence, through guidance, through love. This is where the personal merges with the transpersonal, where we realize we are not islands, but bridges, and what flows through us can either enrich the world or pass through unnoticed, depending on how awake we are to our interconnectedness. Symbolically, this stage also brings with it a soft blending of the inner masculine and feminine, a psychological reunion. Men who once had to prove their strength may now find beauty in tenderness. Women who once had to uphold others' needs may now rediscover their sovereignty. Jung believed that in the second half of life, the unconscious offers us traits we left behind in youth, not as regressions, but as restorations. Traits once suppressed to survive now return to help us serve. It is not uncommon to find a seasoned executive learning to paint, or a mother of grown children starting a non-profit. These acts are not frivolous. They are statements of the soul reclaiming its voice. They speak not of success, but of essence. And yet, some resist this transformation. They remain in the warrior stage, clinging to ambition long after its glow has faded. They fear that stepping away from the race means becoming irrelevant. However, what they do not see is that true relevance is not tied to speed, but to depth. A mentor who listens deeply changes more lives than a manager who demands results. A parent who learns to apologize teaches more than any lecture, and a person who softens their sharp edges for the sake of love becomes a vessel for something larger than themselves. In this way, legacy is not what we leave behind. It's what we extend forward, through those we've nurtured, guided, or inspired. One woman once shared that in her younger years, she chased validation through work and perfection. She believed her worth was measured by productivity, but it wasn't until she became a caregiver for her aging mother that she understood what presence meant. No one clapped. No one watched. But in the silence of feeding, bathing, and simply sitting, she found her truest self. It was not loud, it was not spectacular, but it was sacred. That was her statement. Not written in words, but etched into the soul of another. Ultimately, the statement stage is not about making declarations, but about becoming one. It is when your life itself becomes the message, where every act, no matter how small, radiates the truth of who you've become. And as you move through this stage, you realize that your value was never in your achievements alone, but in your capacity to connect, to care, and to contribute. This is the beginning of true spiritual maturity, a stage where love no longer needs to be earned or proven, but simply lived. And just beyond this luminous chapter, after the peak of the day, awaits a new horizon, not the end, but a surrender, not the silence of retreat, but the silence of completion. The twilight of life begins to glow, and with it, a deeper wisdom arrives, that the final task is not to hold on, but to let go with grace. This is the soul's final return, the last turning of the sun, the next stage, the spirit. And then, as the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon, a deeper silence enters the soul. It is not the silence of absence, but of arrival. After a life spent building, striving, loving, and letting go, there comes a sacred turning, the moment we stop reaching outward and begin listening inward again. This is the spirit stage. Not because the body weakens or the world fades, but because something eternal stirs beneath it all, something that has always been waiting. At this stage, the soul is no longer driven by ambition or the longing to be seen. Instead, it begins to remember. It remembers that it was never just a parent, never just a title, never just a body walking through time. It was, and always has been, part of something vaster, quieter, and far more enduring. Carl Jung described this stage not as an ending, but as a return. A return to the self, to the origin within, to the eternal flame behind all temporary forms. The final task of life is not to gather more, but to release. Not to speak louder, but to listen more deeply to the voice that has been whispering all along. This transition is not always graceful. The ego resists dissolution. It wants to be remembered, wants to matter, wants the story to go on just a little longer. But if earlier stages were about doing, this one is about being, and being in its purest form asks for surrender. The emotional challenge of this stage lies in relinquishing control, in loosening the grip on all the identities we once clung to for safety and meaning. Our roles fall away like autumn leaves. The hands that once built empires tremble. The names we carried proudly no longer echo with the same significance. But in their place, something luminous begins to take shape. A quiet awe at the miracle of simply existing. We are not fading, we are returning. And to resist this return is to suffer. To embrace it is to awaken. Jung believed that nature would not grant us such long years without a purpose, and that aging itself carries hidden wisdom, a kind of spiritual crystallization that cannot occur in youth. This perspective turns the fear of aging on its head. Instead of seeing it as a slow erosion, it becomes a sacred compression, a refining of essence. The spirit stage is when life's earlier concerns begin to seem strangely distant, and this can be painful at first. The things we once fought so hard for now seem irrelevant. But this is not a loss. It is the soul shedding what no longer serves. Just as a tree lets go of its leaves to survive the winter, the aging psyche must release its attachments to bloom into something more eternal. Imagine an old man sitting in a small room, sunlight pouring in through sheer curtains. His bookshelf holds worn volumes, his walls are quiet, and his days no longer rush forward. Once, he was the architect of towering projects, a father of 4, a husband, a teacher, a man with purpose etched in every gesture. But now, he spends his afternoons in reflection, not on what he built, but on what it all meant. He finds himself staring not at a calendar, but at a candle's flame, wondering what burns at the center of it all. He remembers the rush of youth, the striving of the warrior, the ache and beauty of love, and he weeps, not from regret, but from the vastness of it all. In this stillness, he begins to see his life not as a collection of events, but as a single unfolding gesture of the soul. He no longer fears what comes next, because what comes next is simply the next unfolding of what has always been within him. This is the essence of the spirit stage, to transcend the physical while still dwelling within it. The body may falter, but the self expands. In this final movement of individuation, we come into contact with the collective unconscious, the invisible root system beneath all our separate lives. We begin to sense that we were never alone, that every joy and sorrow was part of a shared dream. Death no longer feels like an ending, but like a homecoming. And paradoxically, it is in this acceptance of impermanence that we become most whole. The fragmentation of the earlier years, between persona and shadow, ambition and love, self and other, has now converged. The spirit sees all of it as one living story. Nothing was wasted, nothing was wrong, everything was part of the great return. But if we resist this passage, if we demand relevance, cling to youth, or beg the world not to forget us, we lose the quiet gifts of this stage. We may grow old in body, but remain young in soul, trapped in an illusion of permanence. Jung warned of this, that those who fail to turn inward in later life may fall into bitterness or despair. They mourn the fading of their roles instead of celebrating the unveiling of their essence. And so the spirit stage becomes not just a privilege, but a responsibility, a call to surrender, to reconcile with mortality, and to glimpse the divine in every ending. True psychological maturity is not measured by how well we perform in life, but by how peacefully we let go when life begins to release us. To reach this level of maturity is to finally see life not as a climb toward something better, but as a spiral inward, toward depth, toward truth, toward union. The wisdom of this stage is luminous because it no longer seeks to prove anything. It simply is. The ego is no longer in charge. The soul is. We no longer fear being forgotten because we now understand that what is eternal in us cannot be erased. Our legacy is not just in the deeds we leave behind, but in the consciousness we pass on, the quiet shift we inspired in others, the wisdom seeded in conversations, the presence we held even in silence. And so, in the spirit stage, we stand at the edge not of death, but of awakening. The world outside may grow quieter, but the world within begins to sing. It is here, finally, that Jung's words ring most true. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. The sun may be setting, but the light within has only just begun to rise. There comes a time, often quiet and without ceremony, when we no longer search for ourselves in the world's reflection, but begin to see ourselves in the stillness we once tried to avoid. Psychological maturity, as Jung envisioned, is not a finish line we cross, but a deep remembering of who we've always been beneath the masks, the striving, the seasons of identity. It is the realization that every version of us, the confident youth, the driven achiever, the devoted caretaker, and the seeker of spirit, was not a separate life, but a necessary chapter in the same unfolding soul. We did not outgrow them to discard them, but to carry them forward in wiser, quieter form. Each stage left a trace, a lesson etched not in memory, but in essence. And as we step back from the rush of becoming, we begin to feel what it means to simply be, not in stagnation, but in presence, not as a role, but as a resonance. The truth we sought outside us begins to rise like mist from the ground we've always walked. If there is one lasting insight to hold, it is this. You were never broken, never behind, never lost. You were unfolding. Growing into the capacity to witness yourself with compassion, to hold life with reverence, to move through time not just chasing meaning, but becoming it. The journey inward is the greatest path you will ever walk, not because it leads to answers, but because it leads you home. And this home is not built of walls or names or accomplishments. It is made of presence, of the soul, of the quiet knowledge that you are always enough. Maturity, in its truest form, is not about what you know or how much you've done. It's about how deeply you can listen to yourself, to others, to the sacred silence that holds everything. So if today you feel the ache of transition, the loosening of old desires, the whisper that something inside you is shifting, trust it. It is not a sign of decline, but of arrival. The final stage is not the end of the story. It is where the story finally breathes, where the self steps forward without needing to be defined, where your spirit becomes the message, the presence that remains even when words fall away. Jung gave us a map, not to escape life, but to enter it more fully, to walk it awake. And as the sun sets on the horizon of your own becoming, may you remember, the light is not leaving you. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here, in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this, when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation, that is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.